Yep. Hello indeed. Hello and welcome, one and all to the Gaz Williams Show. Hope all is well with everybody. Just getting set up here. Now, I'm holding a guitar. Why am I holding a guitar? Well, I've got a guest joining us tonight on the show. His name is Mr. Charlie Francis. Charlie will be joining us at 8:30. I forgot I told Charlie to join us at 8:30, basically. So what I've got now is I've got half an hour of just spontaneous filling time to go, which I just thought, oh no, I forgot. I told Charlie last week about 8:30 and I was going to do something, but I forgot. So I just grabbed the nearest instrument, which is an acoustic guitar. So I thought what we could do in this half hour then is just have a little chat about a few things, because why Charlie's coming on the show is, well, we're currently working on a project together and we've worked on many things over the years, and Charlie is he's a bit of a mentor to me in many ways. He's had years of fantastic experience working as a music producer, and we have really nice, interesting conversations about music production and all sorts of elements that go into that, and like the politics of being a music producer, for instance. So these conversations, I just enjoy them so much, and the last one we were having, I was thinking, we got to do this on the show because there's just way too much useful information kind of, well, coming from Charlie anyway. So Charlie will be joining us then, as I say. Turn it up. Am I quiet? Let's have a look. Thank you for mentioning that. Let's see if that's better. Just getting a bit more gain there. How is that? Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Right. So Charlie will be joining us in about 25 minutes. So from now until then, well, let's think. So I'm sure I've mentioned a lot about my kind of introduction into music production, but I mean, I didn't really start producing kind of professionally until early 2000, 2001, around that time. The previous decade, I'd been really focusing on being in bands and had done a little bit of production working, just making demos for other people, really. And music production was always a huge lure for me. Way back when I first started getting interested in making music, I got a 4-track, and I think I always considered myself a music producer, sort of from about the age of 15, albeit, not a very good one. But anyway, the whole kind of path for me, was very much, I'm sure, like many people, really, starting with a 4-track cassette recorder and starting to accumulate other bits and bobs. I got hold of a TR 606 drum machine for 40 quid, I think it was. So that was my main sort of drum machine. Oh, and I loved that thing. Oh, anyway, to have loved and have lost, etc. But so that was my little setup. Really, was like it was an Amstrad Studio 100, the worst 4-track ever made. But it was a funny old thing. And this 606 drum machine and some guitars, and I had a bass. My first bass was a K, and it had a missing tuning peg, so you always had to have like a pliers with you. But anyway, that initial little setup, I was able to sort of put some drums down, put some bass down, try and put in some guitars on there as well, but also a few little bits and bobs with synthesizers as well, like an SK1 Casio, the classic, and what else did I have back then? Well, now I had two things going on. I have mentioned this before, so apologies for a repetition of this, but as I was getting into that stuff, I was also getting into music sequencing, and I had a BBC microcomputer. My parents were teachers, and quite often the children of parents who were teachers would have a BBC micro at home, or would have one that they could bring back, and so this BBC micro was an enormous part of my life growing up, really. And one of the things that made that computer quite special was it had lots and lots of interface ports on it. A little bit of background about the BBC computer was that I think there was this initiative in, I think it was about 1980, 1980 to 1981, for the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, to create an education package around home computing. And it was deemed that having a computer, building a computer that could then be part of this education package, go out to all the schools in the country. Inky, BBC Model B, alas, no Amiga or Spectrum, but it was Chucky Egg. Well, thank you, Thomas R. Which camera do I use? Just a quick aside there. This is a not massively expensive Sony a6000, but it's got a Sigma lens on it. This is the 30mm lens, or my newsreader lens, as I like to call it. Yeah, Steve Elbows saying, yes, familiar with the Child of Teachers, BBC Micro weekend and school holiday experiences. Yeah. Wagyu saying he remembered that the ZX Speccy 128 supported MIDI output via RS232 port, MIDI to MIDI DIN, and its play routine in BASIC earlier. Yeah, no, it's cool. So, Chucky Egg, it's funny you mentioning Chucky Egg, because I am in a band called Chucky Egg. I've been in Chucky Egg for 20 years. It's an acoustic band. I might have mentioned that before, but yeah, Chucky Egg. But anyway, that BBC Micro, one of the things that made that computer kind of special, because it was quite expensive. I think that it was maybe a bit over-engineered in a way, but it had all these interface ports on there. And the reason for that was there was all these kind of peripherals that you could get. And sometimes my parents would bring some of those home, like I think it was at Logotron or something. It was this weird turtle robot. It was like a kind of translucent green thing. And if anyone remembers Big Track, similar kind of thing to Big Track, but a bit more sophisticated, you could program a whole load of routines in, and it was the thing about learning programming, really, I think. Max saying his older brother used to make him type in the ZX Spectrum for 2 hours. Oh, and then you'd get kicked off and he wouldn't let you play the game after you typed it all in. That's not fair. But yeah, I mean, gosh, yeah, remember that. I remember doing that too, just copying code, typing it in, and it was so easy to get syntax errors. But I mean, I was quite fortunate that my parents were quite open-minded to kind of computers. And I remember my dad I'm not sure where he got it from, but brought home a ZX80 back in 1980. This was the white one. It couldn't produce graphics. All it could produce was ASCII keys, text essentially. But there were games where it was just all using text for the graphics. And I don't mean arcade. I mean arcade games with very, very basic text. But yeah, the Spectrum, of course, the ZX Spectrum, which was the ZX80 begat the ZX81, and then following the ZX81 was the Spectrum. And I did have a Spectrum as well. And I loved the Spectrum, not quite as much as the BBC in a way, but the BBC just was, I don't know, it was pride of place, the BBC was in our household. But we used to go to computer fairs in Olympia, Earl's Court, big trade fairs for computer games, and it would be for all the different home computers at the time. I don't know if any of you in the audience went to any of these things, but they were really quite big events at the time. You'd have like the big software companies of the day, like Ocean, for instance. It was a British, Manchester-based, I think, computer game developer. They would always have a really big, ostentatious stall, and but throughout the course of the day, you'd be trudging around, being able to maybe get a few glimpses or a few goes, perhaps, at some upcoming games. Oh, man, it was all so exciting. But pretty much by the end of the day, I kid you not, you would be wading knee-deep in flyers and little bits of rubbish. It was astonishing. However, one time I went up there, I went to this kind of, they had like some stalls where you could buy things for cheap, like peripherals for cheap. And they had Music 500 systems for cheap. I'd read about this or heard about this, but it was essentially an 8-voice FM synthesizer in the most ugly, boring casing you could imagine, just like a block, no controls on the front, and it sort of had like a sort of metal surround that was painted in the same sort of BBC beige, one of the world's least sexy colours. And on the back of that unit, the only kind of interface on there was a DIN socket, but it wasn't for MIDI, it was actually audio. You could get the audio out, but you'd have to get one of these kind of DIN breakouts. So I had a little DIN breakout that went into phonos, that went into my little ghetto blaster. But this thing was amazing because it was a genuine 8-voice FM synthesizer. So the first year I had it, it was Music 500, and the interface for it was just basic, was just all programming, text, mode 7 programming, just like basic. You'd have to basically code your sequences, so you'd have to learn, was it called Ample? I think the language was called Ample. But then the following year I managed to get, I can't remember how, but it was like an EEPROM, and that, I think, and it upgraded it to a Music 5000. And the big thing with Music 5000 was it had a graphical user interface of its own, which, albeit very kind of basic, made it was just an enormous jump up from having to code things, So this thing was, for me, I mean, this is really early days of music sequencing. I'm talking about 1987, I think, is when I got Music 5000. And you could program drums, and you could program, well, you could do the whole thing, because you had 8 voices, 8 monophonic voices. But even though they were monophonic voices, you could do all sorts of things. You could make like a single voice sound like a chord, and famously, Vince Clarke from Yazoo and Erasure, and obviously Depeche Mode before that, he adopted this system as his kind of system, and it's what he did all his work on. And but what the thing that gave it like a vitality for me was there was this scene, and the scene you'd get like a floppy disk full of tunes that other people had coded for Music 5000, and a lot of the time, there'd be lots of hits. Like I remember having a really fantastic version of West Side Girls, West End Girls, not West Side, West End Girls by the Pet Shop Boys, and Erasure sometimes was another one, and there was like hits of the day had been sort of programmed into Music 5000, and that was that. I used to just really marvel listening into these demos. But what was really cool was you could then mess around with them as well, and you could kind of just adjust the settings, and so that gave you all sorts of insight into kind of music production, I suppose, but also this idea of being able to make a complete song yourself without anybody else. And but that was really liberating. But information, of course, the World Wide Web as we know it was still many years away from being accessible. But a lot of these demos, they were kind of passed around on Newsnet, and was it Newsnet? But like the internet as it was, which was all like a university-based thing. So that sort of stuff. It was really exciting to get a new disc of tunes, full of tunes for the Music 5000. Oh, I'd be just like really excited, almost like getting like a bunch of albums, loading these songs in. And it just felt really impressive at the time. But I went ahead then and started making these tunes, and they're really bizarre tunes when I think about it. Sadly, none of this exists, because when my parents moved house, they threw it all away. They threw all of my discs, all my floppy disks away. It was just, I'd left home many years, before that, and, you didn't need all that old rubbish. So, yeah. So those tunes are just this kind of vague memory for me. I don't think I've got any of them recorded onto tape. But like, I remember thinking at the time, I wanted to try to get my Music 5000 tunes across into the 4-track. But the two worlds felt so kind of separate from each other. But this definitely set me off on the path anyway, this particular path that I'm still on all these years later. But my path was had this duality, because I was doing this music sequencing at the same time I was learning to play like bass guitar and play in bands. So the two things were very much in parallel, really, and I've completely continued to be that all through my life, really. But yes, I suppose that's partly why I'm holding an acoustic guitar, just because it's almost the opposite of technology in a way, sort of like an acoustic instrument. So having spending a lot of time in the in electronic music, in the DAW, just to kind of get away from that and just play an acoustic guitar is, I really love that. I always feel a craving to get back to the basics. So I missed back a moment ago. Traitor to Living, thank you so much for your tip. You're asking me to talk about my green Roadstar. You've got a red one that you got from your dad. Well, we could do that briefly, couldn't we? So moving on from acoustic guitar. Yeah, this is an old guitar. I haven't had it that long. I've had it about maybe nearly 10 years, and it came through a friend. But yeah, the Roadstar 2 series, I think it says it. The text is kind of pretty worn off the headstock now. But of course, with the characteristic, matching pickup covers and matching and painted headstock as well. So this guitar, I think this era of Ibanez guitars kind of led to the shredders, the real super speed shredders, and the development of the Super Strat. I think this just predates the Super Strat. It's got the Ibanez tremolo on, although my tremolo arm, I've never actually managed to get the right tremolo arm. This one doesn't quite fit. It sort of works, but also you can see I've got the GK, the Roland, the GK3 pickup on there. I used this a couple of weeks ago with the GR55, I think. Did I? Or was I using the bass up? But yeah, but I've got bass guitars with these pickups on as well. That sort of facilitates kind of guitar modeling and MIDI triggering. But yeah, I was... oh, actually, I can show you a bass guitar because this bass is my oldest instrument I've got. Thank you, everybody, though. I'm filling time, as I explained earlier. My guest will be with us in 10 minutes. Wow, it's a bit dusty. But this one here, this is an Ibanez Musician. And this bass I got, wow, how long ago did I get this? I got this bass back in, I think, 1989, maybe? And why I wanted this particular bass was, this is what Sting used to use around the time of Regretta de Blanc, a fretless one as well. And for Christmas, when I was 15, I got given this book, which was How to Play Rock Bass, with a picture of Sting on the cover. And Sting was my big hero when I was that, and a few years earlier. And it was a picture of Sting. And this is the bass that he was playing, one of these. So this became something I really sought. There was so these Ibanez Musicians, I think they launched around 79, 1980, and really well made, Japanese made, through neck, active pickups. So it's a weighty old thing, but really decent build quality on it. This was when I think, the Japanese instruments were still just, coming into sort of prominence, really. Yeah, it's a good instrument. I mean, it is good. Needs a little bit of TLC. Haven't played it probably for a while. So, yeah, but this instrument is I vowed I'd never get rid of this one. And I've gigged loads with it and used it loads and loads over the years. Yeah, it's just, big part of my, of my kind of development as a musician, really, was this instrument. So I've got a lot of love for it. And it does sound good. It does have a really good tone. Paul Mint is saying fretless bass always reminds him of Paul Young. Well, that's like Pino Palladino, isn't it? The fabulous Welsh bass player. It doesn't sound very Welsh, Pino Palladino, but yes, he is Welsh. He's from Cardiff. And I was a huge Pino fan. I mean, Pino was the man, still is, one of the great, all-time great bass players, 100%. His brother Julian Palladino, fabulous percussionist and a really good bass player too. He joined my band. And I didn't know initially that his brother, well, I didn't know his name was Palladino. I think I might have made the guess otherwise. But yeah, Julian joined the band as a percussionist. And then I found out his brother was Pino Palladino. Oh my God, my head nearly exploded. And Julian, he's got this amazing groove. He's a, phenomenal percussion player. And his brother, Mark, the middle brother, so there's Pino, Mark and Julian. Mark was a wicked drummer. It's like there's something about the Palladinos. They've got groove. They are groovy cats. Right. So anyway, just a little, these are just little kind of anecdotes about things. I hope you don't mind. It's quite indulgent for me to share these things with you. But yeah, I... just having a quick check with the head. Yeah, nice. Thank you, everybody. Checking in with the chat room. So Charlie, let me tell you a little bit about Charlie, because he'll be with us in a couple of minutes. So Charlie Francis, he is a music producer based in Cardiff, but in the 90s was very busy in London. I think he moved to Cardiff in around 2003, I think. But, well, we will be talking to him a little bit about his career, so I'll let him do the talking. But we met fairly early after he'd moved, and I'd found out then that he'd produced an album which I was absolutely well into, which is Hawaii by a band called the High Llamas, and their previous album called Gideon Gay as well. Check it in and check it out. Fantastic. Like, it's sort of like, if you like Pet Sounds, that era of the Beach Boys, that sort of harmony and depth is something that really informs the High Llama sound. Shauna Hagen, the front man of High Llamas, and the kind of main guy, I guess, wonderful string arranger, and would do these beautiful, Brian Wilson-esque, gorgeous sort of arrangements. So if you're interested in that sort of stuff, check out High Llamas. Hawaii, I think, especially. So Charlie produced that, and that was, oh man, that made me really excited to meet him, because, when you meet somebody who's worked on music that really means something to you is is a super exciting thing. But yes, Charlie also, has worked on some pretty cool things. And another one that I only just discovered that he produced was the Noisettes. I've got their debut single here. It's amazing. And Charlie produced it. I think it's a debut, but So the guy has got producer chops, so it's a real pleasure to have him join us. And, ladies and gentlemen, may I bring in the good man himself, Mr. Charlie Francis. Hello, Charlie. Oh, I got him muted. That was nearly slick. Hello, Charlie.
Nearly slick's close enough.
All right. Oh, God. Okay. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure.
So I was just telling everybody a little bit about High Llamas and how I was a huge fan of Hawaii, especially. So that was so. Just give us a little bit of background, then, Charlie. Then, so
I can give you chapter and verse if you want.
Like myself, you were a bass player, and
yes, originally,
you had a break early on because you were Toyah Wilcox's bass player, right? When she was breaking through. Could you tell us a little bit?
I think I joined her band when I was 19 and quit just before my 21st birthday. So I was with her for a year and made an album, a live album, did some touring, did some TV, had some experiences that a boy from Yorkshire wasn't necessarily expecting to have at that point.
Yeah, so actually there is the old Grey Whistle Test performance, I think, isn't there?
It's amazing. So skinny.
So bass player, tell me was that your instrument? Did you sort of get into bass playing? Was that your first instrument?
I think yes, it was. And I think, to be honest, it was for a really it was a sort of, when you're a teenager, you have all sorts of really fanciful ideas about how the world works. And you see things and you make connections that don't necessarily exist for real. And I loved Pink Floyd. When I was 13 or 14 and Dark Side of the Moon was a new album, and I just played it to death. And the fact that Roger Waters was kind of the guy, I loved the lyrics. I was really impressed by the sort of philosophy on display as I saw it in my teen years. And the fact that the lyrics were written by Roger Waters and he played the bass kind of meant that therefore I should be a bass player.
Yeah, because Roger Waters is sort of he's always considered not a particularly technically proficient bass player, but a very kind of functional kind of bass player.
Yeah, it's bizarre because some of the stuff that he plays on, I don't know, things like The Wall, as I say, it's functional, but he actually makes incredibly simple things actually quite groovy.
Yeah.
Which I think is quite a skill.
Yeah.
But he's definitely no technician,
Yeah, no, I always find that quite interesting because he's, he is a peculiar character, Roger Waters, isn't he? In many ways, he is somebody who is incredibly cerebral and maybe overthinks things, possibly.
Yeah.
So it's kind of nice that his bass playing seems like almost refreshingly opposite to
worldly. Yes.
Okay, so
if you go back and listen to the Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and he was trying to do some sort of more melodic things, and as far as you can tell in that very murky mix, they weren't necessarily executed with any real brilliance, but he obviously worked out a role that works for him as time went on, and I think in that band there was one amazing musician, and the other three were kind of like, somehow between them they created a phenomenal sound. You wouldn't say that necessarily any of them were like great technicians apart from Gilmour, but
yeah.
But yeah, that was a very formative kind of influence. And then I really got obsessed by, as we were talking about the other week, about Bootsy Collins and Louis Johnson, who I thought was phenomenal, and Bernard Edwards with Chic. They were all, when I was like in my teens, they were all my heroes, really.
So you told me a rather kind of envy-generating tale about going to see Funkadelic back in the day. In sort of, what was that, in the sort of 78 or something?
78, yeah.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
And going from York and travelling down to Manchester.
Travelling across the Pennines in the fog in my mate's Reliant Robin three-wheeler.
Going to see Funkadelic in a Reliant Robin three-wheeler. Yeah.
And we were from York, which is a funny, it's a very sort of picturesque place, but it's a backwater, And as far as we were concerned, we were the only three people in the world that had ever heard of Funkadelic. We'd read about them in the NME. So we go to Manchester, and all of a sudden we're in a venue with 2,000 people who know every word of every song, and they're dressed in outrageous costumes with lightsabers and things. That was quite an interesting, eye-opening experience.
Right.
There's more to the world than meets the eye,
So when you moved down to, did you move down to London first and then got the Toyah job, or did the Toyah job necessitate the move?
No, I moved to London. This is a funny story, actually, I think. Do you remember the punk poet Patrick Fitzgerald? Does that mean anything to you?
No, I don't think so.
He was like a sort of NME favourite back then, sort of 78, 79. He had a single called Safety Pin Stuck in My Heart, which he played an acoustic guitar, and he was called the punk poet. That was his thing. And he played a gig in York University, and I was just about to move down to London. I had no real plan. I was going to stay in my girlfriend's parents' house that they didn't know about, and then work it out from there. Somehow managed to survive. But went to see Patrick Fitzgerald, and afterwards me and a couple of mates sort of got our way into the dressing room, and being a sort of cocky, mouthy young northerner, I said, "If you never need a bass player, I'm your man." Sort of joking, really. And he said, "There's going to be an advert in the NME or in the Melody Maker. I'm putting a band together. If you see the advert, give it a call." And I thought, yeah, right. So anyway, I moved to London, and probably about a week of that gig, me and my girlfriend went to see John Cooper Clarke at the Marquee.
Now I know him.
Yeah, and that was phenomenal. And we're standing there in the audience, and this little fella comes up to me and goes, "Hello, Charlie." And it was Patrick Fitzgerald. He remembered me. He remembered the name. And he said the advert's going to be in the Melody Maker tomorrow. So I called up this advert and went for an audition, and got a job playing bass in his band, and we did a tour and made a single, and and after that, then it was like, now what are we going to do? And there was another advert in the back of Melody Maker, and that was for Toyah. Oh. And apparently I was the 80th bass player they'd auditioned.
What? Oh my goodness! Yeah. So Toyah obviously is super familiar to a lot of us, but especially having this rather strange lockdown fame with Robert Fripp from King Crimson doing their Sunday lunch cover versions, which had a bit cringy but also quite amusing.
I haven't really watched any of it. I watched a bit of one episode just because somebody told me she said something nice about me, and she did. So
there we go. But Toyah, though, back in, are we talking 79, 1980?
Yeah.
So punk had kind of happened big time in sort of
Yeah.
like 77, and then this kind of maybe more exciting aftermath, the post-punk kind of explosion of creativity and all sorts of stuff. Toyah then was she a credible artist back at that time?
I think that would depend on who you asked.
Okay.
She was. I don't think she was ever seen as particularly cool by like the music press or anything. She had a very devoted fan base, and I mean, people said the strangest things. And we had some interesting people would come to our gigs. There was a kid called Mark who was about 15 who would turn up at any gig we played near London, and we'd like find him like hanging about by the sort of stage door. It's like, oh, it's little Mark, and he went on to be to form S Express.
Mark
Mark Moore of S Express.
Wow. Mark Moore. Yes.
Yeah. And whenever we played in Birmingham, these two outrageous figures would turn up. These skinny guys with incredible clothes and tons of makeup, called George and Marilyn. And of course, that was Boy George and Marilyn, and they would like come and hang out backstage. So it was really weird. So she had these people that, you know, really were devoted to her. But the comment a fan made to me one day that I just thought was hilarious. Because, I mean, really, the music that we were playing was, I think it was a kind of watered down prog rock, if I'm honest, at that point. You know, there was kind of odd angular riffs and sort of long extended workouts. And it wasn't really pop music, but it definitely wasn't punk. I remember some guy saying, some sort of, you know, fairly rough and ready guy saying to the dressing room after some gig somewhere, "You're the only real punk band left." I thought, well, it's nice you think that, and it works for you, but I'm not really seeing it, you know.
I mean, she was it the punk priestess? Was that like one of the names attributed to her?
She got called all sorts of things. But I mean, it was obvious that she was going to be incredibly successful. And to be really honest, what happened with me was I realised that if I stuck around, I would be forever known as Toyah's bass player. And I just had other plans for myself, really. I just didn't... If you'd been David Bowie, I would have felt differently, you know. But, you know, I didn't feel like it was sufficiently just in line with what I really was into and what I liked about music for me to want to have my colours nailed to that particular mast from there on. So now it's quite nice because people refer back to it and it's got a certain sort of cool because I was so young and we did things like the whistle test, but I haven't had to live with that sort of tag going around, you know. There are other things that people associate with me with, that people I've worked with, that I'm much happier about, you know. Obviously you brought the High Llamas, which is one, which is sort of a bit more, you know, obviously more of a speciality act, if you like. But obviously having worked with R.E.M, people always going about, oh, you work with R.E.M, and that's an immediate calling card. And I have absolutely no qualms about people like attaching my name to them whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're going to certainly lead on to talking about R.E.M, but before we get there then, this transition then from being a touring musician and into being a music producer, can you tell us a little bit about how that came about?
Oh, it was quite long-winded. So after I left her band, I was like trying to get my own band together, basically writing songs and playing sessions whenever anybody would ask me, which they would do occasionally. And eventually there was a guy I'd been at school with, my old friend John, who was a fantastic guitar player, who had gone and joined the Revillos when he was 17, if you remember the Revillos.
Yeah.
And John was a phenomenal musician, so I sort of got hold of him and said, "Do you want to come and join my band?" And he was living in Edinburgh with the Revillos, and he said, "I'm going to give this a bit longer, but if it doesn't work out, I'll come and join you." And he did. So then we sort of spent a couple of years playing all the sort of crappy pubs in London, playing the Rock Garden, and, you know, nobody there but our girlfriends and our best men. But eventually we got this huge record deal, and we were being managed by Bill Kirbishley, who managed The Who,
yeah.
And Page and Plant and Judas Priest, and a guy called Clive Banks, who had a plug-in company, and while he was manager, also became the managing director of Island Records. So we kind of plugged into this sort of massive machine, and we made a record in New York. We went and made a record in New York with an American producer called Frank Filippetti, who'd worked with Foreigner and all sorts of people. And Frank was a really lovely guy, but I don't know that I was ever comfortable in that role because I was being the singer, and it was like I'm not one of life's natural frontmen, and I've got a certain kind of voice, but I'm not the world's best singer, and I don't think I was ever particularly comfortable. We made this record, and then in classic sort of 80s music biz style, the parent company changed all of the personnel of the record company in Britain, and we came back from New York, and they were like, I don't know, you could tell they hadn't signed us, and they were trying to work out what they were going to do with all these acts on the label, and it just didn't work out really, and we ended up sort of putting them in a position where they had to drop us because otherwise they'd have had to give us more money. And they
must have been that must have been quite a depressing experience, and sort of going over. It must have been so exciting to go over to America to make this record, and then for it to sort of essentially be shelved.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it was a weird time in my life for personal reasons. I don't think I was in a particularly good place, and I think that it was all just part of the whole sort of milieu of not being particularly happy about anything in life in general. So actually, when it came to an end, although it was kind of like, now what am I going to do? At the same time, it was a bit of a relief.
Yeah.
It was almost like, I don't know, I kind of felt like the burden of expectation had become so high. When you're plugged into people like that, there's no room for like trying things out or experimenting or, it's all growing slowly in the dark. It's like you've got all guns blazing, and it's quite intimidating, Yeah. And I have known people who are much more ready for that, but I certainly wasn't, and I don't think it would have done me any good. So, I don't regret. It was I had an amazing experience recording like Electric Lady and Right Track and the Hit Factory, and
wow.
Which was all and lived in New York for a few months, and all that was great. But after that, in London, we had some like live musicians that we used, and one was a partner in a 24-track down near London Bridge called London Bridge Studios, and I just started hanging out there, and it was really weird because he'd got this computer with a very early like sequencer package. This is pre-Cubase or anything, made by a British company called Iconics.
Oh, okay, wow.
And another guy who'd got a studio on the same floor of this building had the first Akai S900 sampler I'd ever seen, but neither of these guys knew how to use this stuff. So basically, I built myself a room with some, gyprock in a corner of the building, and sat there with these things and worked out how to use them. So then I started doing a lot of programming for people, and just, and I got involved with the guy. We kind of formed a production company, and we made quite a lot of money making some fairly awful music for a couple of years. And at the end of that, I realized that actually I wasn't really being true to myself, and that actually I liked working with bands. And there was a guy who'd been an engineer on loads of sessions that I'd played bass on in my early 20s called Ian Capel, who actually, he worked with Tricky on his second album, and he'd like engineered all the Tinder Sticks records.
Oh.
Ian's got an amazing CV in Shriek Back. He was massive.
Wow.
Yeah. And I worked with a few of those. So Ian was a partner in another studio in West London, and he realised that I knew my way around the studio, so he just started giving me engineering gigs. So I just started, making it up as I went along in this 24-track studio, and like people would come in, and that was what led to the High Llamas. So one day, the guy, his partner in the studio, a guy called Harry, who is now a partner with Simon Napier Bell, who used to manage the Yardbirds and Wham.
Yeah.
They have this thing in Las Vegas called Raiding the Rock Vaults. That's their big thing they do now. But back then, Harry was just the co-owner of a little 24-track studio in Shepherd's Bush. And if someone was coming in who was bringing their own engineer, he'd say to me, I'll pay you the same, but I'd just like you to be there and make sure everything goes fine. And anyway, this band were coming in, and I'd kind of heard of Micro Disney, which was Sean's previous band.
Right.
But I didn't really know anything about the Llamas, and they came in with this engineer who was a great engineer, but clearly wasn't really interested in sort of producing it. And although I was just meant to be like there to sort of smooth things along and go and set up mics or go to the shop or whatever, I got on so well with Sean right from the start. We really hit it off, and in every break we'd be talking about music and like sitting at the piano and going, and I started adding like ninths to all his chords. I mean, his chords were great anyway, but I'd like play silly versions on the piano. And we really hit it off. And then somehow or other, I ended up sitting behind the mixing desk saying, do that again. And at the end of it, we went for a drink, and he said, "I'm going to give you a co-production credit." And that was an album called Santa Barbara, which was the one before Gideon Gay. Basically, it had been an EP, and they needed 4 more songs, so that's what they were doing. So I worked on those 4 songs. And then Sean and I just became friends, and I'd go and see them play, and I'd go and see them. You sang a bit of Checking In, Checking Out just now.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing them play that for the first time in the Old Queen's Head in Stockwell to like 3 Men and a Dog, and just thinking, that is so incredible, that song.
It is. I mean, Check It In, Check It Out. I mean, that is still a future hit waiting to happen, isn't it?
It got a huge amount of airplay on, it was like, I can't remember, was it Capital or LBC? One of the London stations played it to death when it came out. But anyway, so
classic.
what happened was, yeah, so Sean and I, like I say, we've just become really good friends. And then one day he said, "Oh, there are these guys in Brighton have got a little label and they want me to do a single." He said, they've only got this much money. I think we can make an album. That was how we made Gideon Gay for like a ridiculously small amount of money in a very short amount of time. That still involved setting the drum kit up twice, which was crazy. And yeah. And then on the back of that was like, that just got rave reviews and all the press. And then Sean was actually kind of hunted by the majors. He went to Ireland. He's got Irish relatives. And he came back, and someone from one of the majors had put a poster on a billboard at the end of his street in Peckham saying, "Do you know this man?
Wow.
We sign him to this record label," which Sean was deeply embarrassed about.
Gosh.
Anyway, he did a deal with Sony, and then he had a bit more money to play with, and that was when we made Hawaii, which involved a lot more studio time and a lot more trying out all the ideas under the sun, and a lot more, trying out all. And it was quite funny as well, because in between, he and I had worked with a few other bands where Sean got to try out some of his sort of nascent ideas for arrangements. And so I remember the first time we did something with strings, and the first time we did something with brass, and he was sort of getting his palette together. And then we went in to do Hawaii, and he basically could wield all of that stuff.
Wow. Because, I mean, if you're not familiar with that album, Hawaii, and please get familiar with it, because you will. There's a lot to discover there. If you're interested in sort of like Sufjan Stevens' sort of Illinois, there's a few kind of textural similarities to that. Almost like, although albeit 20 years before or something, but that album is there's many songs on there, but there's also these like long instrumental kind of more like interludes really on there. Can you tell us a little bit about how that developed then?
Yeah, well, Sean had an awful lot of songs, and we basically, most of the time it was just me and him, like other people would come in, Rob would come in and do drums, but things never started with the drums. They would always start with either a piano, which would be double tracked, or a Farfisa organ. And at that point, did anything start with a guitar? I think by that point he'd stopped doing things with guitar as the basic instrument. It was all piano or organ. Maybe Theaterland or something. Anyway, so
that's a great.
We basically put down the sort of keyboards and start doing overdubs, and then the drums would sort of come along later, and the bass. So it was kind of done in a slightly sort of upside down way. And every song had like strings and brass. And then there'd be some decision made in the mix about what was actually the most effective, and because it was very dense, and it was all on 24-track analog tape, and juggling all that stuff was just mind-boggling.
Did you have any automation?
Yeah, there was I can't remember what it was called. It was on an AMEC 2520, I think, in Blackwing Studios down in Borough, and it had a really basic, simple, like PC based automation thing, which did work, but it was just faders and mutes, yeah, and that would just be me and him like fiddling about for hours, and then between every track on that album, there are like weird little bits where basically we'd have like got the Moog out, and I'd make bubbly noises with the Moog, and then we'd filter the strings through the filters, and we'd turn everything backwards. And we just made up all these sort of strange little things, which we then ended up, having as the interludes on the record. In fact, when we went to master it, we went to Mute Records, because his manager Andy was the managing director of Mute Records. Went to their studio for a day and just like worked out all the bits we were going to use in the master and sort of got it all sort of straight in our heads. And then the next day we went to Abbey Road and did the actual master with Steve Ruck. So there were a lot of times when it was literally just me and Sean in the studio trying different things, and that was the first album that he actually got to use some real vibes on. And Sean, because he writes songs on the piano, but he's never been trained as a pianist, so he doesn't have a lot of like classical technique. He's never been trained to do proper legato pedaling, for example, which is a skill you have to learn if you're going to be a proper pianist. But when you're just comping an arrangement, he wouldn't use the pedal really. But then when he wanted to use the vibes because it's all over things like Till I Die or whatever of the Beach Boys, and so he'd hired this set of vibes. Because his songs are so harmonically dense, and you would have basically practically a key change every 4 bars at times. The very sort of dissonant chords that follow one another. That's his main thing, really, is harmony. But of course, if you're playing like a figure on the vibes, because the vibes have that great long sustain when you have the pedal down, you have to like release the pedal and then put it down again so that the chord. So. At first it seemed like an insurmountable problem because Sean was doing it and he put the pedal down, but then there'd be a chord change and it'd just be this horrible blur of like polytonality.
Yes.
And then he tried doing it without the pedal. Of course, that doesn't work because it's just on bonk, bonk, bonk.
Yeah.
So, but then I worked out that you can unscrew the pedal on the vibes and turn it around the other way. And I got John Bennett, who was the guitar player, who was mainly in the live band, really played a bit on the album, but I got him to lie on the floor and operate the pedal with his hand for all the chord changes.
Now, did he get credited for that?
Do you know what? He didn't.
Oh!
And I think he complained. Lovely fellow, though.
Yeah.
Lovely fellow. Very willing.
So, what year was this? 94?
It's 5?
95.
5 or 6.
95, 96. Okay, so like mid-90s time. So now we're kind of, I guess, post High Llamas, then how did the R.E.M. how did all that come about then? Because we're approaching that time, aren't we? Because it was the 90s.
Yeah. Well, I was really busy in the sort of mid-90s with all sorts of people, most of whom have languished in obscurity ever since. And then I had a manager one day phone me up and he said, "Are you sitting down?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, sit down," which I thought was ridiculously melodramatic. And then he said, and she knows how long ago it was, he said, "I've got a fax from a lawyer in New York, and they say that R.E.M. are interested in Charlie Francis engineering their next album." And of course, I didn't believe him at first, but then,
R.E.M. were one of the biggest bands in the world at this point in time, weren't they? They
were sort of... They were slightly off the peak at that point, but a few years earlier, their big albums that sell like 9 or 10 million copies each, Monster and Out of Time and Automatic for the People, and probably Green as well. Yeah, so they flew me out to Athens to meet them and spend a week, Athens, Georgia, that is. I spent a week in their friend John Keane's studio. And then I came back and waited to hear if I got the gig, and I did, and then I went out and worked with them in San Francisco for a few months.
Wow, which studio was that then?
It's a place called Toast, and it was a place where Muddy Waters used to record in the 60s.
Okay.
And it had a proper old Neve 8068, 804, one of those fantastic early 70s Neves with like very, very simple like functions, but just sounds amazing. And it had a load of it had like Neumann M49s, a couple of C12s, it had a really great microphone collection. It was like a proper old fashioned studio. And also, that sort of stuff is much more commonplace in the States. You don't tend to see it in studios in Britain. Even the big ones don't have that, somewhere like Abbey Road will, but very few other places. But it's much more commonplace in America to come across that really like the creme de la creme of the sort of real vintage gear that, has a very well-deserved reputation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, and subsequently I found out from... I knew that part of the reason I was there was because Peter Buck was a huge High Llamas fan. So Hawaii was a big part of the reason I'd got the call.
Right.
And but then what was really funny was we would walk to the studio every morning. I mean, they take such good care of you, that band. So I was staying in the same ridiculously swanky hotel they were, which is, incredible, really. And I would walk to the studio, it's like a mile and a half or whatever, every morning with Peter Buck and with Scott McCoy, who's like there's one of their auxiliary musicians, who is an absolutely wonderful human being, and who I mixed an album with, actually, that he'd recorded with Wilco. Made an album called Down with Wilco, which I mixed a few years later. Wow. Anyway, Scott and Peter and I were walking to the studio one day, and Peter stopped to go into like the magazine stand to get some magazines, and I was just chatting to Scott on the pavement, and I was telling him about an album I'd made for Creation, and with a Scottish band called the Diggers. And Scott said, "Oh yeah, we love that album." I was like, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, Peter loves that album." I was like, "You're kidding." So anyway, when Peter came out of the shop, I said, "Scott says you like the Diggers," and he was like, "That's one of the reasons you're here." He said, "I listened to that album every day for 6 months." Which was just incredible.
Wow.
And there were this four lads from Glasgow, and we made this one album for Creation that sadly, it got an absolutely rave review in Mojo. And they said there was one of the songs on there that should have been on Abbey Road instead of Octopus's Garden. Really, slightly hyperbolic. Yeah. But it was a nice record, but it didn't really fit the Creation ethos, because it was a kind of 60s pop melodic record. It wasn't
because Oasis had sort of taken Creation into that rock and roll sort of decadent rock and roll-y sort of area, I suppose.
And also all the things that they were really known for were like just noisier, whether it was Primal Scream or My Bloody Valentine, it wasn't that kind of thing, it was much more sort of ear friendly, really. Not I've got anything against any of those bands, but yeah, for one reason or another, it just didn't happen for them with Creation, But yeah, it's just amazing that this record that I thought was, forgotten, was one of the reasons why I'd got this call. So that was quite bizarre, really. Yeah,
wow. So I mean, so what kind of task were you doing then in the studios? Were you essentially selecting mics, putting the mics in position?
Yeah. I mean, they had a co-producer, a guy called Pat McCarthy, he'd worked a bit on Monster, and he'd been the engineer on Automatic for the People, so they'd known Pat for a few years. So they'd made their last record with Scott Litt, who they'd made like 3 or 4 albums with, and for whatever reason that relationship had come to an end. So they decided that they would get Pat to co-produce this record with them. So they wanted somebody to come in as an engineer. And it was quite ironic, really, because Pat isn't a musician and is an engineer. And although I am an engineer, I think I'm a musician first and foremost, and I think of it from a musician's perspective. So that was kind of quite a peculiar sort of situation from that point of view. But yeah, I would just set mics up, push up faders on the desk, put it on tape, Mm-hmm. And, it was obviously it was an incredible experience for all sorts of reasons.
Oh gosh, definitely. But I mean, let's just talk a little bit though about the distinction between engineering and producing then, because you definitely wear both hats, being an engineer and a producer, and doing both. But how would you describe the difference between the two roles?
It's weird, isn't it? Because I think it's become very fluid, and the distinction isn't nearly as... Once upon a time, the distinction was very clear. In the early days of the record business, the engineer was the guy who,
touched
did all
the
gear. And the producer very often wouldn't know how to use any of it. There might be an arranger, or there might just be a record company guy, or there might just be somebody, who was like a bit of a hustler and knew a good thing when he heard it, So I think... So that was the original sort of basis for it. But obviously, as time went on, more and more people were engineers, and then they just became the de facto producer, or the band would ask them to co-produce or whatever, And I think that it's about responsibility, really. I think the engineer is responsible for doing their utmost to make things sound as good as possible, but the producer has the responsibility of looking at a bigger picture and I'm always talking to people about the material and about the direction and all those kind of things, which aren't engineering concerns, but are actually really critical. Certainly with young acts, it's like you don't want to make missteps.
How do you find, though, if you're producing and you're working with an engineer, how do you stop yourself kind of looking over the shoulder of the engineer at everything he's doing? I suppose it's picking the right engineer, is it?
Yeah, I haven't done that for so long. I mean, I'm just chief cook and bottle washer these days. So,
yeah.
I mean, actually, in the past, there were people that I would work with. There was a studio I worked in London called The Fortress quite a lot. It was called The Greenhouse, then became The Fortress down in the city by Old Street. And there were a couple of guys there who were like sort of the studio guy. And they were great guys, and I would let them do loads of stuff. And it was just, and that was, I really enjoyed it. And there was another guy with the unlikely name of Jamie Cullum, who was a really great engineer that I would get to come and do. He was a freelancer. I'd get to come and do things for me. So I did like it when it could happen, but it just never happens these days. If I've got someone around occasionally someone will want to come and intern and learn some things. Most people only do it for half a day and then get bored. But there was one guy who came and he was great, a friend of mine called Lewis, who I'm still really friendly with. And he came and helped out in a number of sessions. And just be able to say, can you go and move that mic 2 inches on that guitar cab to someone else while you sit and listen, can be invaluable, but it's a bit of a luxury these days.
So I know our audience are a bit, there's one or two gearheads in the audience. So let's just talk a little bit about the development of the studio. Now you were talking earlier about working in the 24-track studio with some automation. Now the transition from big mixing desk, reel to reel, through to kind of modern DAW production. What's your story in that? When did you sort of transition, if you will?
Well, funnily enough, it was when I moved to Cardiff. So I'd always been working in studios, and the studio in West London actually had a euphonics desk that they got at one point in the sort of mid-90s, and I became pretty good on the euphonics, which is quite an unusual desk, It was much more automated even than an SSL. You could automate all the sends, you could automate the EQ. It was a digitally controlled analog desk, so it was kind of a precursor to what we do now. And recalls actually worked, whereas a recall on an SSL was always a bit frustrating. It was always like, it's kind of something like, but you did a recall on the euphonics, and because it was digitally controlled analog, it would be reset to what it had been, as long as you lined up the tape machine properly, and what any outboard you had going on. So that was kind of quite good as a sort of background. And then when I came to Cardiff, there was a band that I was making an album with, and obviously it was on a small budget. They were paying for it themselves. And when it came to we'd recorded everything, and I said, look, the amount of money you've got left, we can go to a recognised mix studio for like 2 or 3 days, and that's it, and get whatever we come out of there with. Or give it all to me, and I'll spend as long as I think it takes, because I think I can probably do a better job spending more time doing it in Pro Tools. And I did, and it really worked out. I think, I was really happy with how it came out, and so I never looked back. And also, I think that there was a very conscious sort of mental event that happened where I decided, okay, if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to start mixing in the computer, I can't it's not an excuse. I can't say, I know it doesn't sound that great, but obviously we did it in the computer, not on a mixing desk. There can be no reason why it doesn't sound as good as anything else. So I sort of adopted that mindset from the off. It's like, it has to compete. It has to sound just as good as what you would hear by any other means. And worked with that in mind, really. And,
so we're talking. You mentioned Cardiff then, so that was quite a big change then in the early 2000s. Then leaving London and coming to Cardiff. What was the most notable sort of thing that happened in that move?
In what sense?
Well, I mean, to reflect on how different, say, Cardiff was to the scene that you were leaving in London and arriving in Cardiff.
I mean, they couldn't be much less alike, really. I mean, right. Cardiff is a relatively tiny place. London is absolutely immense and is a hive of activity. What's bizarre, though, is there are a lot of people sort of, or there certainly were back then, there were a lot of people sort of dreaming of making it, as it were, in London, who've been drawn there to do that. They're not necessarily the most talented people. So you would, quite often end up working with people who like had this idea they're going to be a superstar, and you're really struggling to find something worth putting together. And then actually somewhere like this, there are a lot of people who don't have any illusions about getting anywhere, which is a bit of a shame because some of them should be a bit more ambitious. But there's actually, people with real raw talent, people with like real ability. Yeah.
Right.
So that was quite an interesting shift. I just want to go back to something you said when you were talking about me before I joined in. You mentioned the Noisettes.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a funny story that I think is worth repeating. So what happened was my then manager, he was friendly with their manager, this woman called Susan. He said, she's got this band called Sonarfly, and they're trying to find the right producer to work with, and she's having whatever, it hasn't quite worked out. Would you like to do a couple of tracks? And I heard what they'd done, and they had this incredible singer, this sort of Brixton Zimbabwean singer called Shingi Shoniwa. And the stuff that they'd done just sounded horrible to me. I really didn't. But there was clearly a voice there, and I was very curious. And I went to see them rehearse, and it was her and Dan, the guitar player, and they had a guy playing the drums who was just terrible. It just wasn't working. And I spent the day in the rehearsal room with them. And at the end of the day, I went home and I thought, I can't do this in all conscience. And I called Dan up, the guitar player, who's a lovely fella. I said, Dan, look, I think you and Shingi are incredible, but this isn't working for me. That drummer I can't promise you we can go in the studio with this guy and do something that I think is worth recording. So if he's your guy and you want to do that, then please go ahead with my blessing. It just won't be with me. Or I've got someone in mind, and this was the really bizarre thing, because the guy I'd got in mind, I'd not seen play the drums. I'd seen him. I'd been later with Jules Holland with R.E.M, and there was a woman there, I think she's called Wiley, singer-songwriter from Brighton, and she was playing with this guy who was basically playing percussion, but he was like doing like three things at once, and you could see he had proper like four-way independence, even though he was just playing percussion. And he was really groovy, and he was really young, he was like 18 and 19, had this mad mop of like curly hair and this huge beard, and charisma. And I chatted to him afterwards, and funnily enough, quite a few of R.E.M's crew, they picked up on him, and they were like, man, that guy's great. And we were chatting to him afterwards, and I made a point of taking his number. And I said to Dan, I've never even seen this guy play the drums, but I've just got a feeling that him and you, there's something there. And so he came to the studio, and he had a mad drum kit. He came to some rehearsal room in Shepherd's Bush, and they started playing, and it was immediately magical. Yeah. It was just, and it was so right. And, and with Shingi was, and she's not really a bass player, but she's playing the bass, and she's kind of like doing a job, but she's like dancing and singing and playing the bass and just looking like a superstar. And the two guys are just grooving away, and it was like, yeah, this definitely works.
That is super cool. I mean, because it was like an incredibly exciting band. I mean, my goodness. Well, I'm just looking now just to remind myself on what's the name of the first single?
There was an EP called something like "What's the Time, Mr. Wolf" that was like had stuff I did on it, and then there was a song called "The Count of Monte Cristo" that was on the first album,
nice.
An acoustic song that we did.
Yeah. I'm just trying to find it because I was blown away by it. I thought it was amazing.
That's great.
So yeah, wow. So I was just like, yes, another positive tick there. Right. Well, so we're going to move now into we're into the 2000s.
Yeah.
Settled in Cardiff, and have been very involved in the Cardiff and the Welsh music scene ever since. And now this was a scene that I was really big part of. I moved to Bristol at the same time. I think you were moving to. I think you arrived in Cardiff just as I left. So
what a shame.
I made space for you.
Very gracious.
But yeah, so you mentioned that about Cardiff, about being maybe less pretentious or less kind of sort of, and in a way, that's something that's not appreciated so much by the Welsh, is it? They that kind of pose, that London pose thing.
No.
And so what I feel like, I often reflect on the difference between Bristol and Cardiff. Cardiff, I always feel, is a much friendlier place. But the music scene in Cardiff is quite gentle almost. Like a lot of the acts who've been the breakthrough acts from Wales, really. From the Gorkies and Super Furry Animals, and there is a sort of like a wistful, folky, gentle thing that kind of heavily influenced by Brian Wilson. That's a big. So I can see how maybe like the High Llamas kind of vibe has a certain connection with the Welsh music scene.
I never thought of it quite like that, but I mean, obviously Sean's arranged strings for the Super
Furries,
so very direct connection there.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, because I mean the Super Furry Animals, if you don't like, they're a well-known band in many places for sure, but in Wales the Super Furry Animals were, maybe still are, the kind of the main band in a way. Maybe not the biggest selling band, but the kind of most influential band on the scene. I would say.
Yeah, the way people relate to them. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and they're sort of very much rooted in it as well. They're very, you'll see Griff or Dav or Kian around and about. They're accessible people, and they're still very much part of the community,
and get involved with acts as well, and huge supporters of other people. Yeah, really, really important, hugely important to the Welsh music scene,
and genuinely lovely people.
Yeah, absolutely fabulous. Did you come across the Super Furries then back in when you were working sort of with Creation back in were they a band that you crossed paths with before you came to Wales?
I'd gone to see a very early gig, I think, when Creation had only just signed them. I went with Mark Bowen and Dick Green, who went off to form Wichita, who worked for Creation.
Of course.
They played at some London college, and I went and saw, a very early Furries gig. I think probably before the first album had even come out. So, I knew who they were, to be honest, they'd never really connected with me musically until Rings Around the World. And then I remember being in my car one day, listening to the radio, and Juxtaposed with You came on. And I just had to pull over to the side of the road because I thought I just had to listen to it because I thought there were so many very, very clever and very human things about it. And the lyric was so perceptive, but also there was so much sly humour in the music and the vocoder stuff. And it just seemed to be this incredible melting pot of things, and also just executed with real aplomb. That record still sounds phenomenal, that album. It just has such an incredible, depth and sort of 3D quality to it.
Lovely, yeah. I always feel that Super Furry Animals have sort of existed in this particular place where they never quite had the massive hits, but they should have. But their influence in Wales though is just is enormous, really. And so
I think Northern Lights got to like number 11. That's a fairly substantial hit.
It's good, yeah. It's just like it never cracking the top 10. I think so. Just but in a way, existing in that kind of sweet spot of playing really good gigs and having a really loyal following, and and selling decent amount of records, but not selling out and not maintaining the kind of that credible kind of curve. Anyway, okay, let's move on a little bit now. Hey, Dan Moore in the chat room saying Noisettes were a killer live band, so that's that's cool. Dan, fabulous musician, who's been on the show. He plays in a band called Modulus 3, based in Bristol, and who are awesome. So your production, you've been very, very involved in production, but in recent years, you've actually been treading the boards again, haven't you? And going back out and playing and being a musician again.
Which is it's weird because I didn't do it for a long time, and in a way, I wouldn't go as far as to say I regret it, but I think I should have done it. I think it would have been good for me to do it. I think it was partly it's living in London thing as much as anything else, and like I'm going to do this one thing, whereas living somewhere like this, and it's like suddenly all bets are off, and you can do whatever the hell you like. And there was a young guy I started working with called Dan Bettridge from like Ogmore, Bridgend way. Spoke to earlier today actually. He was a lovely fellow and really talented singer. I'd met him at a thing at the BBC, and at first it was just him and his acoustic guitar, but gradually sort of introduced him to the concept of other instrumentation, and then got to the point where I said, I think you should try something with the rhythm section, but I think it should be like not just a couple of your mates, but some people, some sort of seasoned hacks who know the score and who can do the right job for you. So I played bass, and I got my dear old friend Jack Eggleston from Future to the Left to come and play drums, who's an incredible and very versatile drummer, and one of the nicest human beings in the world. And so we did some recording with the three of us, which was fantastic. And then Dan said to me one day, he said, I've got a gig in Shoreditch, will you come and play bass? I was like, really? Because I'm literally the same age as his mother. I said, are you really sure? And he was like, I don't care about that. So then, I did quite a few gigs with Dan, and we went to Canada twice. We went and played at CMA and then, what's it called? NXNW in Toronto. And and that was really good fun and really, really enjoyable. We did a couple of nights supporting Band of Horses at Shepherd's Bush Empire, which came out of the blue and was amazing because they were sold out shows, and at the point when we went on stage, everyone had come into the venue. So basically, like, people pushed up against the front of the stage when we went on, and they loved it, and we got a great reaction. So as a way of, like, piggybacking on someone else's talent and just having a good time being a musician.
Nice.
What a joy that was. It's just good fun,
So then, but you've actually put out an album of collaborations probably a couple of years ago now.
I put out 3 albums effectively. Mm-hmm. What happened was I started making weird little bits of music just for my own entertainment in bits of downtime. Things where I'd think, can I make a piece of music that doesn't have any music in it, where I'm not thinking about notes or chords or anything, where it's basically like a soundscape, but a musical structure isn't evident, and just like setting myself little sort of mind tasks like that, and ended up with this whole slew of pieces, and let a couple of people hear them. They were like, "This is great! I'd listen to this." I was like, "Really?" So I kind of assembled that and put it out on Bandcamp as an album, which felt like a really weird thing to do, but And then after I'd done that, I thought I should really do what I've always done, what I always did, and write some songs rather than just make these sort of odd bits of quasi-ambient music. And I got this idea of writing an album of songs where I would basically pick a singer and I'd write the song, get them to sing it, and I'd do everything else. And in the process of doing that, there's a really interesting musician in Cardiff called Gemma Roper.
I know Gemma well.
And Gemma lives in her own universe and has an incredible way of writing lyrics that no one else would ever write. And is sort of one of those people who has like a take on the world that is unique. And I thought I'd really like to do something with Gemma, but there's no way I can write a song and say, sing this tune. Because it's just not going to happen. She's just not the kind of person. But I said, if I write a piece of music, do you want to try writing something to it? And she was really up for it. So we did that, and it worked out really great, and it was really easy. So that became an album before the album I was supposedly making. We finished that album, and Rich put it out in bubble wrap. And then I finished the album, so it's got people on it. I mean, Welsh musicians, people like Sweet Baboo and The Gentle Good that people, and Dan Bettridge, as I mentioned just now. So they sing all of them, and it was great because then I got to like flex some more musical muscles and show off with some chord progressions and try out some of the things that I liked doing musically, and it was really nice.
Yeah, nice. And like some of those names you just mentioned, Gentle Good and Sweet Baboo. Well, you worked with Sweet Baboo on some recordings.
Yeah, I've worked with Steve on and off a few times over the years. Yeah,
and you'll catch Steve playing with Griff Rhys out of the Super Furry Animals, frontman of the Super Furry Animals.
Or Kate Le Bon.
Yeah. So there's some really great artists. I mean, I know we have some audience in Wales. But a lot of people tune in from all over the place, really. So just shining a little spotlight on the Cardiff scene is definitely worth doing, because there is a definite sense of songwriter equality. I'm trying to put my finger on it. With the acts that you've mentioned, there is these are musicians who are not afraid to show a more sensitive side.
Absolutely, yeah. And Sweet Baboo, it's in the name, it tells you what he's like, really. He's a little guy, and his songs are gentle and quirky and sometimes funny and incredibly musical. I mean, he's a phenomenal musician. I was like, funnily enough, I found myself watching a YouTube video of one of the songs we recorded recently, and in the video, you see him playing bass and organ and baritone sax and tenor sax, all of which he does on the track, as well as all the guitars and singing it and writing it and arranging the strings, although we got a string quartet to play the strings. But yeah, he played all these, this ridiculous array of instruments.
But I mean, but just in contrast, though, then to this kind of more sensitive singer-songwriter side of things, you did mention Future of the Left, and that's a band you've also worked a lot with, and that's a bruising band if ever there was.
Yeah, they're about as violent as a band gets. Really. I don't mean personally, and I love those guys. I mean, I think that Andy, the main guy, who's known as Falco, I have an awful lot of time and respect for, but I think that I'm not necessarily convinced I would make another record with him, because I don't think that as personalities it brings out the best in us to be in a studio together. I'm really, really proud of the stuff we've done, and I think that the whole, because I did bits of the previous album, but the whole album I did with them called How to Stop Your Brain in an Accident. It's got some really uncompromising, very dirty, very heavy, nasty, aggressive stuff on it.
So, I mean, if you haven't encountered the band Future of the Left, they are essentially what happened to the band called McCluskey, who was a Cardiff band from the late 90s, early 2000s, who sort of kind of broke big in certain areas, like Australia. They really cracked it. And then that band imploded, and Future of the Left, I suppose, was what emerged from the the debris of McCluskey. Is that right? Or have I missed a bit?
Yeah, basically, McCluskey were a three-piece, and John Chappell, the bass player, there was a kind of eruption. He went off to live in Melbourne, but that left Andy and Jack, who I mentioned earlier, and they've been through, various people have been in and out of the band. Currently, it's Andy, Jack, and Andy's wife, Julia, plays bass, and they have various people that sort of do things with them live, but mostly it's just the three of them.
And well, interestingly, Julia, she did an album that you produced, and similarly, she brought in all sorts of really interesting vocalists on her own, including Frank Black from the Pixies. Yeah. So this all, there's some really nice interconnectivity going on. Right. So let's see where we're at. So, okay. So we're more or less up to date now. So let's talk a little bit about. So are you still a Pro Tools? Is Pro Tools your chosen platform that you work within?
It is, except now when I do all my mastering in Reaper, funnily enough. I use Reaper as the wrapper for mastering, because And Reaper's it's a bit too deep for me. So I learn as much as I need to get it to do what. But I've assigned some macros on the keyboard myself to do certain functions, which is the sort of thing you can do in Reaper that you can't do in Pro Tools.
Right.
Don't really help my workflow, but it slightly frightens me. I don't know if I'd want to track a band in Reaper, because I think that it's so flexible and so all-encompassing. I think you could easily come unstuck, whereas with Pro Tools, there's kind of one way of doing things.
Yes, very interesting. And echoes my experiences. I've used Reaper for many things, not so much recently. I did try to kind of move from Cubase to Reaper, but ended up kind of getting into a little bit of a mess when it was coming to editing. And
I think that's where you come unstuck. Multi-track editing is a bit...
Yeah. However, I mean, Reaper is an astonishing platform, and you do need to work it with Reaper, don't you? You need to kind of make it do what you want it to do, and because it is so flexible, as you mentioned.
It's so deep and so powerful and so and very elegant, really, in its functionality.
Yeah.
It's no mistake that the person I know who is most au fait with Reaper is also someone who is an incredible sort of proper tech head, computer whiz kid,
Right.
because it suits his mindset.
Yeah.
But I don't know how much time I've got. I don't necessarily want to have my head under the bonnet, as it were.
Yeah, and you do, don't you? With Reaper, if you want to use Reaper, you do have to kind of get your hands dirty, I think.
Yeah, I mean, obviously with mastering, because it's a less sort of elaborate operation, then you don't need to get as far into a lot of the functions. But, for that, it is so elegant, and it does a lot of things really nicely that make it a very satisfying way to work.
Yeah, nice. So if you're working then in Pro Tools, is your kind of approach more like using it as a tape machine, and then you will kind of edit? No. Right. Okay.
Actually, no. That's a bit glib. It's project dependent.
Right.
But my take on it generally, and as an overview, is that I think we've moved into an era, and I say this to people, and it might sound a bit pretentious, but I think we now have the potential at our fingertips where music has become completely plastic. So in the past, we were sort of limited, and things like mixing desks and tape machines, like they pinned you down to a certain way of working, a certain mindset, and a certain workflow. And now you can do anything. Your imagination is the limiting factor.
Yeah.
And you can manipulate things, and you can take things and you really can sometimes turn base metal into gold. You have the potential to do all sorts of phenomenal things that you couldn't have dreamed of doing before. And I suppose, at this point in my career, because I've done so many different things, I kind of have a fairly good idea of what I'm trying to achieve. I think if you're starting out, it's probably a bit more mind-boggling, because then it's just a limitless sea of possibilities. What do you choose? But I think there's a plasticity about music now. So it's like you just take all these different elements, and whether it's musically or sonically or structurally or tonally or whatever it is, you can play with it in any way that you see fit. So there are points in the process where you might be using the computer as a tape machine in a certain kind of way, but not really, because it becomes a hybrid sooner or later, and the degree of hybridization, it's exponential. Things can really sort of go off on a mad tangent that's got nothing to do with what you started with, very easily,
So, well, I mean, I think what I was kind of interested in, though, is like this kind of the traditional way, like working with a band like R.E.M, for instance, and setting up the mics and getting a really nice sound, trying to get the sound right before at source. I was just wondering if any of those kind of things you've carried over, as opposed to like, are you a fix it in the mix kind of guy, or are you trying to kind of get the goods at the, on the way in?
You know what? I've never really laboured over sounds at source. It's like you get a sound that you like, and then you get on with it, and it's much more about the performance and the spirit. And then, like I say, in the age of plasticity, then you can chop it and mangle it and do whatever you like with it. And even that R.E.M. record I worked on was a sort of transitional record for them. And there were a lot of things that would just start, like Peter had found this $30 keyboard in a junk shop that had a really funny little drum machine in it. And some tracks just started with that, playing a weird drum pattern, and like Mike Mills playing a couple of chords. And so, it's quite sort of, contemporary, if you like, in that sense. It was, there were some things that started out tracking where we'd set up a whole band. But, it might have Peter playing bass rather than guitar or something. They'd like swap around the instruments. And, so even they were like, although there was a traditional element in terms of setting up a band and recording it, it wasn't like everything. It was.
Had Bill left the band? Bill Berry.
Well, when I went to meet them in Athens, Georgia, it was really weird because I got there and there was a guy there called Barrett Martin who'd been in a band called Screaming Trees.
Oh yeah,
he was a phenomenal drummer and another really lovely guy, big bear of a man. And Barrett was supposed to be playing percussion, and Bill Berry wasn't around, and Barrett was like being asked to play drums at that point. And there was this weird atmosphere, and like the three members of the band would go off with Bertis, their manager, into huddle in the other room like every so often. There was this strain, and basically Bill Berry had left the band the day before I flew out to Athens.
Oh wow!
So they weren't telling anybody, and
right.
Even the guys who were playing with them, who were like definitely insiders in their camp, weren't being clued in as to what was going on, because obviously it was cataclysmic for them. It was a massive thing.
Wow. Gosh, I mean, and that band had been that same lineup for, well, through all that kind of success, I suppose. Yeah, wow. Yeah. Interesting. So, I mean, so if you record, when you're producing then, and you are maybe taking vocal takes, for instance, when you are then comping a vocal take, what guides you in making, we're assuming that the takes are all pretty good. What do you typically use to help you make those kind of decisions where you're not picking from like something that's trying to find something that works?
Yeah.
Because that's another kind of job. Yeah. But assuming you're working with quality artists, what techniques do you rely on to help you make those kind of decisions?
I don't know if there's a technique. I honestly think, this is a boring answer, but I think it's experience, because I can remember making vocal comps in like 1990 and being terrified, not knowing what I was doing, not knowing, is this good? Is this bad? Is this the right one? And now it's instinctive,
right.
So I'll do like a bunch of takes with someone and say, I'll just make a comp. And someone like Steve, Sweet Baboo, he'll just say, make the comp and then play it to me. I know you'll do it better than if I was like leaning over you. And then I will just do it. And it is just a feel thing. It's just like, go, that's right, that's not right, that's right, that works, that doesn't work. It's just like, and it's just from doing it for a very, very long time and having a sense, and you're listening for a whole load of things. Obviously, you're listening for like, obviously tuning and timing, diction, phrasing, other words right, and then the tone, the timbre, the sort of intensity, and whether what the feeling of the line is, and what the dynamic is across the song, if there's a sort of a shape, if there's an arc, and all of those, you're kind of juggling all those balls all at once. But like I say, just having done it so many times, it doesn't feel like a chore. Where once upon a time it was terrifying, difficult, and I could say the same about mixing. When I first started mixing, and I'd be in some studio with an SSL paying like 800 quid a day. Well, I wasn't paying, but somebody was paying 800 quid a day for some SSL room. I'm just like feeling like, what the hell am I doing here? Like terrified, and like every day was just like, sweating. And now I love mixing. There's nothing I like more than laying into someone's tracks, and and again, that is just from doing it for a long, long time,
right,
and getting very comfortable with it. I think the one thing I would say though is that when I was younger, I would probably do too many takes. And I think that an awful lot of singers, a good singer, generally speaking, the first or second take is going to be mostly brilliant. You know, if they know what the song is, if they know how they want to sing it, they have a performance in their mind. What happens is they get on the mic and they do that thing they've got ready to go, and they sing that performance. And they quite often what will happen is they'll do it once and they just kind of getting in the zone. They go, let me have another go. And then they do another one. They've got used to the sound in the headphones. They've got used to the dynamic, and they go for it. And you might get the whole vocal or a lot of it. And then what you can hear after that, you hear them starting to think about
Thinking,
it,
yeah.
get frightened of it, and overthink it, and do weird things with the phrasing, and
Right.
and it can just go horribly wrong really quickly. So I, generally speaking, try to create a sort of a laid back enough atmosphere that doesn't feel like this is the end of the world, and they get, it's going to be like fun, and get them into a happy place before they get on the mic. Feel confident they know what, generally speaking, there'll have been a certain amount of pre-production where we'll have had time to go over any sort of aspects of the song that I think need looking at. And so at that point, they should be quite prepared to sort of sing something. So yeah. I will try to get like 3 or 4 good takes. And if we're not getting it in those, there is definitely something. There might be a bit that you have to go, let's just look at that and get that bit of phrasing because it's not quite happening, But so often when you put the microscope on people, it all just starts to fall apart in front of you.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic answer. I mean, this is what I was kind of hoping for. Now, we've worked on a lot of things over the years. I've been super, super fortunate for Charlie to send a whole bunch of things through to me for mastering. And I always really relish these opportunities because they're always beautifully produced and are mixed so nicely that the mastering is always quite pleasurable. And I typically do quite a minimal amount of things really with things that come from you, because if it ain't broke, I don't want to go in there and just start chucking loads of things on them. But Charlie, you do an awful lot of mastering yourself. So
I always feel like you make a good difference, though. You might feel like you're exerting a light touch, but I've always when I get it back, you've done that mastering thing, which is so sort of ineffable. It's like, it feels like it's suddenly kind of solidified and come that bit more into focus, and it's all part of the same thing. And that's, nice. And that takes a certain lightness of touch, I think, to get right.
Yeah, and I'm very instinctive in those kind of ways as well, and try and I try and do as few actual processes as I can get away with. I sometimes put a lot of things on and then will typically pull it back to dynamic EQ and maximize, the maximizer side of things for the leveling. Most of the action is in the dynamic EQ and some very careful multiband mix compression. And if I'm feeling naughty, a little bit of exciter as well. But yeah. So just let's talk a little bit about mastering, and I think that feels like a nice way to kind of bring the proceedings to a close, as the mastering is the last part of the process. Now, we were talking last week about luffs, and this is something that there's going to be an upcoming series on Sonic State, where we're talking about a particular project and the mastering of it and luffs. So we'll talk a little bit about this then, because we were talking about how Spotify, for instance, is recommending that people master to around a kind of integrated LUFS level of -14 LUFS. Typically, I'd be more working with RMS measurements of decibels. But you don't think that mastering to 14 is such a good idea, is that right?
I just don't think people are doing it. I think that people who say that, I think that a lot of people who master sort of big commercial records, they're still making them much louder than that.
Exactly.
Whatever they might want to tell you.
Yeah.
As far as a lot of those sort of people are concerned, the conversation about the loudness wars is redundant. There's like the client wants it loud. That's it. It's like it's not philosophical arguments. It's like this is what the commercial sort of imperative is.
Yeah.
And I think that it's amazing, really, because I mean, you hear certain records, like certain pop records that have been really slammed, and it has a really deleterious effect. It's it can be really quite unpleasant. But there are certain records, rock records that I can think of that are really loud. But whoever's done it, I mean, it's also a testament to the sort of quality of the production, how well balanced it is sonically.
Mm-hmm.
But they've made them really loud. And I don't feel like the mastering has compromised it anyway. And also, I think there is something that is recognised by some people that quality of things being like limited a lot is actually in the way that pop music has always been driven by the technology and the sort of sonic innovations have always kind of like pushed the form forward. I think that limiting has become part of the sound of it's like that's what makes things sound contemporary. I mean, there's no question that in 15 or 20 years' time, it's going to sound dated. But there's no way you can stop that happening because that happens to every era of music. It doesn't matter what you do. You can't future-proof it. It is what it is. It's going to be representative of its times. I think people get very emotive about it and say, oh, they've destroyed it, they've wrecked it, they've trashed it. I don't think it's true. I think, things can be very loud and just they sound good,
Right, yeah.
It doesn't mean you have to make it. Some people are quite happy for it not to be really loud. But most people that I work with, give them the option, they want the louder one,
Yeah.
And I think that, as I said to you, my main objection to things like worrying about what Spotify or YouTube are doing is that they're quite secretive about the standards. I don't know, have they actually publicised that -14? I know that people have reverse engineered it and worked out that that's what they think the standard is.
Yeah, I think there is a page on the Spotify although I'm saying that I've not seen it. I was told that there is.
But also, as a commercial entity,
yeah,
they can change that at a whim any time. So to use that as your benchmark,
yes, it's not good, is it?
You can't do that. What you have to do is make your own decision and live or die by it. And if everyone goes, your records are horribly over smashed too loud pancakes, you're not going to get any work. It's like if people like the sound of your records, you'll get work. But I think that
good point.
To allow a platform like Spotify to dictate without really telling you what they're doing and with the option to change it anytime, it's just
we were talking last week about Spotify, and you were saying how was it a Queens of the Stone Age song that you were really familiar with didn't sound right coming out of Spotify.
Yeah, it was very peculiar. Somebody made me a playlist. They were we were having a conversation, and he was referencing certain things about how he wanted his masters to sound. And he sent me a Spotify playlist. And I haven't really been that suspicious of Spotify. I knew that, I'd heard people sort of voice criticisms of it, but I used it as a tool and didn't think about it in any great depth. But it hit me like a hammer because I played this playlist and this tune came on that I'd ripped into iTunes off a CD years ago. And I've used it as a reference many times because it is one of those rock records that's incredibly loud and sounds fantastic. And it came on this playlist. I just thought, I'm sure this record sounds better than this. So I went immediately compared it to what I had in my iTunes, and there was no doubt in my mind. It was, and now I really notice it. If I listen to Spotify for a little while, I hear the sound of it, and it almost immediatally.
Interesting.
And I don't enjoy it, and so I've been using a high-res streaming service to stream.
Yes, which is called
Qobuz.
Yeah, so Qobuz.
Yeah, it's French. They're French,
and it's like a you pay a fixed amount like you would to Spotify, but the streaming is up to, is it 100? Do they go up to 192 even?
It does go up to 192. And I don't know if there's a technical fudge that means you're not necessarily getting that full bit rate. I don't know. But I do know that when I listened to that, I suddenly found I was just getting much more involved in the music. I was being drawn in, and I was
Right.
staying. You know, everyone's familiar with the sort of the curse of Spotify is like hopping from song to song and like playlist jumping. Everyone does it and like listen to 2 minutes of this, 2 minutes of that. And I think unconsciously, it's because it makes you do that, because it doesn't draw you in the same way. Whereas I found myself listening to Cobras and found it just like all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, that's what music does.
Yeah, remembering how it used to be to listen to music.
Yeah, it was like it's immersive, and it's one of the biggest things I think about it. The biggest sense, and because I think there are lots of things that are different, sort of in terms of the listening experience, but it's the solidity of the stereo image. I always feel now when I listen to Spotify, like the stereo image is very unstable, and that things swim about and aren't as localized as they should be. And you know yourself, when you're mixing things, you put things in very specific places, and it has an effect on the emotion of the mix and how you feel about it, and how what the impact of that instrument or voice is. And I suddenly, I think with Spotify, I don't feel that localization is taken care of. Whereas when I listen on the high res service, all of a sudden it's like, that is definitely there. That is definitely there. And I've got that sense of like a proper stereo field. And I think that, I think for some people, all this stuff's a bit esoteric, and they go on about, the consumers listening to their Alexa or their little Bluetooth speaker, and that's always been the case. People have always listened on
a little dance set or whatever,
tranny radios or whatever. That's always been with us. But I think that if you're someone who listens to music obsessively like we do, you want the most immersive experience you can have, and you want to feel as connected to the artistic intent as you can possibly get. And,
Yes. So, I mean, well, okay. So that's actually I was quite excited when you said about Cobras, though, or Cobras.
oh, yeah.
Yeah, I have, yeah. I haven't signed up to it, but I might try a little trial on it to see how it works. But I think, Charlie, what I think we'll do now, though, is, because I don't want to go on too long, so I think if we sort of draw things to a close, can I ask you, what would you like our audience to check out? Well, this is your free plug now. You can plug whatever you want to plug.
Oh, God. Of things that I've worked on, I assume is what you mean.
Yeah. What would you like people to check out?
Well, the album that you're currently mastering that I've just finished mixing, although I've got to say I have amended a mix and I'm waiting to hear back from the artist whether he wants to use the amended one.
Okay. Are we allowed to talk about that, or shall we keep that? Is that still under wraps?
Well, I think we can mention that there's a new Robin Hitchcock album in the offing, and that's what we're talking about. And
it's brilliant.
I love it.
I've been working on it today, and I love it too. It's an incredible piece of work. And did you say Robin is 68 now, is he?
Yeah, he's had his birthday the other week, yeah.
So Robin Hitchcock...
He's still as vital as ever. I spoke to him on the phone earlier, and he's just,
So, I mean, Robin's had this really interesting career. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with him, but if you're not familiar with Robin, he first came to prominence with a band called Soft Boys, who... not a big hit band, but like a critical kind of smash. Bit before my time, really, Soft Boys. But Robin was very much of that eccentric English songwriter vein, really. Sort of Anthony Newley onwards. Syd Barrett. Very, very... Yeah, some of it is a bit reminiscent of Syd Barrett, but I mean, he's also got such an incredible eclectic approach to songwriting. This album is astonishing, so I'm loving working on it. So that's something to keep an eye out for the next Robin Hitchcock album. You've worked with Robin now on numerous things over quite a big period of time.
I've actually worked with him on 10 albums now. Wow. I realised the other day. Yeah, since '98.
Yeah.
I mean. Yeah, some of them I didn't do all of, but yeah, one way or another, there's 10 albums of his that I've worked on.
And there's an R.E.M. connection as well there, isn't there?
Well, it was bizarrely, I met him through REM rather than the other way around. Of course, they were massive Robin Hitchcock fans. So when they started touring the States and started to be able to pick their support bands, they started to get Robin to support them because they loved the Soft Boys. So, I mean, they're genuine friends going back a very, very long way. So when REM came over in 98 to promote the album that I'd worked on with them, I went to the pub in Clerkenwell with Scott McCoy, who I mentioned earlier, because he was going to meet Robin. And that was the first time I ever met Robin. And, yeah.
Excellent.
And
strangely, there's another connection that we were talking about earlier when we mentioned that you were playing with Toyah in your early days, and Toyah married to Robert Fripp, and then the King Crimson lineup, and there is a little sad tale here really, was using the drummer Bill Rayflin, who was the drummer for a period with REM.
And also plays in a couple of Robin's albums that I worked on.
Right. Sadly, we lost him. Last year, was it maybe, or
a couple of years
ago?
Yeah.
Phenomenal musician. I saw King Crimson. In fact, we were at the same gig where the King Crimson were doing the 3 drums at the front of the stage and the rest of the band on a riser behind them. And Bill was had the central kit, and flanked to his right was Pat Mastelotto, and to his left Gavin Harrison. Yeah. That way around. And seeing this incredible rock band with 3 drummers, sometimes playing absolutely in sync and sometimes playing absolutely out of sync, and in incredible experience. So I just thought that was quite interesting, really, how there was this connection to yourself through Toyah.
He was a great drummer, Bill, and he was one of the driest people you'll ever meet in your life. He had such a dry sense of humour.
It's so sad we lost him, but
it was really sad. Yeah,
but fantastic to have seen him play. Anyway, Charlie, I think on that, that's a bit of a sad note to end on, but so
go and buy the new Robin Hitchcock album when it comes out.
The Robin Hitchcock, yeah. How about your own? But for people wanting to check out your own music, Bandcamp.
Yeah, funny enough, go to Spotify and you'll find my album Songs for Singers on Spotify.
Songs for Singers, yeah. And that's under your name, Charlie Francis, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Please.
That's the one I would suggest if anyone's curious. It's pop music. It's very deliberately pop music, and it was an attempt to write contemporary pop music, so I was referencing things like Kanye and Drake and things like that, which might not be immediately apparent, or people might think I've missed by a mile, but those are, and as well as some of the more sort of the older staples in my musical repertoire, like Ennio Morricone and things that have always upset me. But it was an attempt to make, I was thinking, if I'm going to write songs and I'm going to do them with singers, I should also make it sound like it was done this year, not 20 years ago. So that was the brief I sent myself.
Yeah. Big thanks to HK in the chat room there. That's a very kind tip. So I got a tip. I have to get you a drink next time we're in town. No Bandcamp, Wagyu's asking. The big Bandcamp supporters in our audience.
Do you know what? I'm going to have a look. If you just bear with me a sec, because my original oddball sort of mostly instrumental album is on Bandcamp, but I have to remember what it's under. Isn't that terrible?
Oh yeah, GNU Ninja has found you on Bandcamp, I believe.
Oh yeah, an album called Influence.
Okay,
yeah.
Excellent. Well, Charlie, I mean, thank you ever so much for coming on the show. This is, in a way, this is great. This has just been like one of our phone calls, really.
One of our regular chats. Yeah.
Yeah. So I really wanted to share some of your wonderful insight and wisdom with the audience. So thank you ever so much for coming on. And I hope everybody's enjoyed it. I certainly have. That's the most important. Well, and maybe in the future you can come back on and give us an update of what you've been up to. But I think
as you asked, it is charliefrancis.bandcamp.com is this peculiar album called Influence, which is just me trying different ideas out, really.
Okay, excellent. And then to check out on Spotify, then the album, the songs for singers, and yeah. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Wagyu. These tips, I kind of want to blush, really. Yeah, thanks, everyone. Loads of great stuff in the chat room. So anyone watching this on playback, make sure you engage the chat, because it's a very vibrant and friendly chat we have. YouTube. And I'll be back next Monday with my adventures in Eurorack, if that is something of interest to you, and back on Wednesday for another Gaz Williams show, which I'm not quite sure what that will be, but I'm sure it will be something that you'll have to tune into. And Charlie, once again, enormous thank you. And
I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's been brilliant. Yeah.
I hope it's been interesting.
Oh, well, that's for me. Okay, everybody, I'm gonna remove Charlie from the scene now, just because I need to do it this way. So Charlie, give us a wave, just so then we'll do a fade. We'll fade you off there and come back to me, just to say goodbye to everybody. And again, yeah, thanks once more. Please consider subscribing, liking, and all that stuff, and click that stinking bell if you want updates for when I'm next live. Okay,